Isn't it funny and in a sense amazing how we have more communication technologies, in fact, probably too many, at our fingertips, and still sometimes a message doesn't arrive at who we want it to receive it. It gets confused in some fashion. It gets lost. I didn't get the text, didn't get the email, whatever it is. Well, if that happens today, what about a book written 2,000 years ago? What about a book written 2 millennia ago? How do we know it hasn't been changed accidentally or intentionally? This is a question not just asked by biblical scholars. This is a standard question ancient historians, in particular textual critics, ask. Have the documents reach us accurately? So if the apostles intended to preach truth, but it's been changed over time, then we can't trust the Bible, right? We still can't have confidence in it. Well, we actually, to understand if it's been passed down accurately, we kind of break this into 2 smaller questions. And the first one is, what is the time gap between the original copies and the copies we have today? So how much time has passed from when this document was actually written to a copy that we physically possess? Now, this is probably an obvious question, but you tell me, do we want a bigger time gap or a smaller time gap? Smaller, exactly. Less room for intentional or unintentional error. Now, why this would matter is the scriptures were originally written down, either on papyrus or codice, which is like an ancient book. But what would happen is it would disintegrate. So what they have to do? They had to copy it. So the question is, do we have generation 1? Do we have generation 2? Do we have generation 3? Do we have generation 10? Do we have generation 50? The less generations of copying, the closer we are to the original, because information tends to degrade over time. In fact, have any of you seen that pretty awful 90s movie called Multiplicity with Michael Keaton? Has anybody actually seen this? Okay, the rest of you don't see it, spare yourself. What happens is they clone Michael Keaton, but then instead of cloning the original, they clone the 2nd generation. And then they clone the 3rd generation. And then they clone the 4th generation. By the time the 5th generation shows up, in each generation, a little information is lost, so he's like all messed up. And the idea is information is lost over time. We have to get closer and closer back to the original to have any confidence in it. Well, let me just give you some context before we look at the New Testament. So here's some other ancient writers that are roughly contemporary with Jesus from the time they wrote and the copy that we have. For example, Pliny the Elder, 700 years. There's a 700-year gap between Pliny the Elder when it was written and the copies that we have. Take Josephus, who wrote the end of the 1st century, who does mention the historical Jesus, by the way, twice. 800 years. How about Herodotus, who's considered the most important, or one of the most important historians of kind of the ancient Greco-Roman culture in that world, so to speak, would be 1,500 years. Actually, before the Roman era. 1,500-year gap. Now, what's the time gap for the New Testament? I mean, just look at these. 0 is when it was written, and those boxes represent when we have copies, 700, 800, 1,000, 1,500, catalyst, 1,600 years. What is it, at least a portion for the New Testament? Roughly 40 years. This is where you say, wow, so let's practice. Okay, good. All right, just making sure you're with me, because you can see that the New Testament is in a category of its own. Now, this is something called the John Rylands Papyrus. John Rylands Papyrus. It's probably the size of a credit card from John 18. And it's a small portion, front and back, early 2nd century. Now, historically speaking, that's pretty significant. Now, without going into too much depth, over the past 2 or 3 years, what's happened is we have started to uncover some ancient manuscripts that have been hidden. Not intentionally hidden, but hidden from the human eye for about 2,000 years. So what happens is there's these ancient mummy masks from Egypt. And you know what a mummy mask looks like. They have gold all over them. And do you know what they would use for these ancient mummy masks? They would use old papyri that had been thrown out because it had no value to them. Kind of like when you make paper mache, use newspapers, they would use ancient papyri. Well, my father and a few other organizations have bought some of these. They're able to scan them. You can see it right here. This is my son. They would take it in the background, put these masks with palmolive soap, amazingly enough, soak them because of the lack of a certain kind of acid in the palm olive. And then one by one, as you can see right there, they pull out these ancient manuscripts never seen before. And then they take them down with a computer and in most cases can interpret them right on the spot. My son's reading the Coptic and the Greek and the Syriac. No, I'm just kidding. And they're able to interpret many of them very quickly. Now, why do I mention this? If you get online and look, there's some big debates right now about potential findings that are in the 2nd century and some maybe even in the 1st century. The jury is still out on this, okay? Hopefully in the next few months, maybe a year or two, these things take a while. We should know for sure. But there are some scholars who date these who have looked me in the eyes and said, I have total confidence that we have a fragment in particular Mark from the 1st century. Now, I throw that out there with some hesitancy because we don't know for sure yet. I don't want to overplay my hand, but I do want to make sure you understand that we are discovering newer manuscripts every single month. For example, my dad undid a manuscript, and he found inside of it an early papyrus copy of the book of Romans by 150 years. And then a month later, someone found one even earlier. You see, you don't see this reported in the media. But actually, the more we find, the more it's corroborating the Christian tradition and the scriptures. This is why Dan Wallace from Dallas Theological Seminary, probably the world expert, or one of the top 2 or 3, said, we have more and early manuscript evidence about the person of Jesus Christ than we do anyone else in the ancient world, including Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. Now, I don't know too many Julius Caesar skeptics. I don't know too many people who define themselves as doubters of Alexander the Great. Because when it's all said and done, it doesn't really matter what you believe about their historicity. No offense to any history teachers who happen to be here. But what did Jesus say the most important question is? Who do you say that I am? What we conclude about him historically has huge implications. So the time gap for the New Testament, at least portions of it, is much earlier than ancient documents that very few people actually question. But the second one is, how many manuscripts do we have? Now, the more manuscripts you have, the more differences you will find. But guess what? Even though there's more differences, you now have better confidence that you can reconstruct the original. Okay? And this is something that Jim is going to go into in particular in his talk. Well, let me just give you some context. Augustus Caesar, around the time of Christ, 10 manuscripts is all we have writing about him. 10. That's it. Plato's tetralogies, 7. You count that on 2 hands unless you're Bruce Almighty. How many manuscripts are there for the New Testament? Here's a very, very conservative number. I'm going to err on the side of being conservative. 23,000 plus. Thank you, I heard a wow. Somebody's with me. Nice job. 23,000 plus. It's probably a lot more than that. In fact, right now I'm helping my dad update his book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And we have so many more than this. But I'm going to leave it at this conservative number until it's documented and it's out and it's official. This is enough to show that the New Testament, again, is in a category of its own. So if you just look at it, it kind of looks like this, 23,000 plus for the New Testament. The next closest would be the Iliad, which 1757 is probably getting closer to maybe 1800 now. 10 times as many. And the Iliad was like the Bible in the ancient world to that culture. So here's a way that might help visualize it. The average classical writer, okay, if you take all the handwritten manuscripts that we have, would be about 4 feet high. Stacked together, if you average it out, would be about 4 feet high. Does anybody know how high it would be for the New Testament manuscripts? 75 feet? Good guess. No? 40 feet? No, higher. 200. A lot higher than that. About a mile high. That's right. Thank you. That's the appropriate response. It's incredible. Now, please hear me in this, because I don't want to overplay my hand. This doesn't by itself mean that it's true. What this tells us, we have earlier copies and we have more copies by far than any 10 ancient documents put together. This is what gives us confidence that we can reconstruct the original of what was first written down. Now, probably the most influential living atheist, he calls himself an agnostic atheist, who went to Moody Bible College. He also went to Wheaton. Some of you know who I'm talking about is named Bart Ehrman. Now, Bart says this. He said, there are more variations among our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. So we'd say, you're right. We have earlier copies, and we have a ton of copies. But there's so much variety across these, we have no confidence that we can reconstruct the original. Now, what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to stop, because this is exactly what Jim is going to come up and address. But I want to make sure that you see this is the pushback objection people will have commonly. And it's so important that Jim's going to take a whole session and break this down and help us understand how do we reconstruct the original and how do we have confidence when there's these variations across the different manuscripts. But here's the bottom line. Craig Blomberg said it well. He said this. He said, look, no orthodox doctrine or ethical practice of Christianity depends solely on any disputed wording. He said there are always undisputed passages that one can consult that teach the same truth. So yes, there's areas that we're still trying to probe and understand what the original said. But those are few and far between. And none of them have to do with a central doctrine of the Christian faith. Friends, this is really important. So I know it's been almost 10 years, but how many of you either read the book or saw the movie The Da Vinci Code? You remember the whole church was like in an uproar about this? The idea was that Jesus had married Mary Magdalene and they had kids, and the story goes on and on. Well, what's interesting is one of the evidences given in the Da Vinci Code was what's called the Gospel of Philip, which is probably a 3rd or 4th century apocryphal text. It wasn't written by Philip. And at this time, unless they found new ones that I haven't heard about, in that manuscript it says, and Jesus kissed her on the lips, according to the Da Vinci Code. You know what the manuscript actually said? And Jesus kissed her on the... Oops, that part of the manuscript was blank. We don't have it. So they inserted in lips without telling us that that was read into the actual manuscript. Well, look, if you have 23,000 copies or even a couple hundred copies of Philip, one is missing this part and another one's not, so you can reconstruct what it says, right? And know exactly where he kissed her. But if you only have one manuscript, you have no ability, unless you're guessing, to reconstruct what the original said. It's not like when you come to the Gospels and says, and on the 3rd day, blank. Oh, shoot, what happened on the 3rd day? Man, what are we going to do with this? No, it's nothing like that. So we have to be honest, and Jim is going to go into detail and say that there are some passages we're still not certain of what the original said. For example, the mark of the beast is what number? 666. You know, we have 2 early copies of Revelation. One of the early copy is 666. One of the other early copies is 616. We're not certain what the number of the beast actually is. We have to be honest about that. There's a few small passages like this. But that doesn't take away from the confidence we can have in the whole about knowing the stories, key doctrines, and what the Gospels actually teach. Okay? So what have we done? We'll look at the last one, then we'll take some questions. First question we're simply asking is, do we have reason to believe the writers are honest? They say we investigated it, we saw it, we heard, we touched, we were there, eyewitnesses. But then second, they give very particular details, places and time and people and events that we can check out. Then they give embarrassing content. And then they're all willing to suffer and die for this, shows the depth of their sincerity. They really believed it was true. But then we want to ask, has this been passed down accurately? We have more manuscripts earlier than any other ancient book. I have a friend who's a skeptic, and I said, look, you've got to be consistent here. If you're not going to believe that we can reconstruct the New Testament accurately, you've got to throw out all ancient history. He goes, fine, I throw out all ancient history. I said, all right, at least you're being consistent. Fair enough. Now, the last question we're looking at is this: is there any evidence outside of the book that shows that the internal claims are true? Does that make sense?